The night was unforgiving, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. Daniel pulled his thin, worn-out coat tighter around him, trying to keep the biting wind at bay. The streets had long stopped being a temporary refuge, they were his only home now. For years, he had drifted between shelters, alleyways, and park benches, never knowing what the next day would bring. Yet, despite his hardships, Daniel had something most people in his situation had long lost: his kindness. He still offered a smile to strangers, even when they pretended not to see him. He still shared what little food he sometimes managed to get with stray dogs. That night, as Daniel walked along the nearly empty park, he noticed a faint glimmer under a bench. At first, he thought it might be a discarded can or a piece of broken glass. But when he bent down, his fingers touched leather. Pulling it out, he realized it was a wallet, thick, heavy, and made from the kind of fine leather he hadn't seen in years. His heart pounded as he opened it. Inside, neat stacks of crisp bills stared back at him. He counted quickly, hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. His breath caught. For a homeless man who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, this was more money than he had touched in years. Alongside the cash were several credit cards and a driver's license. The name on it read Richard Hale, and the address listed was in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The photo showed an elderly man with sharp, dignified features. Daniel sat on the bench, wallet in hand, and stared at it for a long time. His stomach growled painfully, reminding him of his hunger. With that money, he could buy hot meals, maybe even rent a cheap motel room for a week and sleep in a real bed. He could afford new clothes, shave, and finally feel human again. The temptation was fierce, pressing in on him from all sides. But then another thought came, quiet but firm: it's not mine. Daniel shut the wallet and held it against his chest as though it were fragile. He knew what the right thing was, even if it meant another night of hunger and cold. Taking what didn't belong to him wouldn't change his life, it would only change who he was. And that was something he refused to lose. All night, he kept the wallet close, afraid someone else might find it and do what he couldn't. By morning, after a sleepless night on the hard wooden bench, he made up his mind. He would return it. The address wasn't far, though it was in a neighborhood so far removed from his world that he almost laughed at the thought of walking there. Still, with the wallet tucked safely inside his coat, Daniel set off through the waking city, not knowing that this single act of honesty would alter the course of his life forever. Daniel's journey to the address printed on the ID took longer than he expected. His shoes, worn and splitting at the seams, made every step painful, but he pressed on. The farther he walked, the more the city transformed around him. The cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered walls gave way to wide, clean streets lined with tall trees and manicured gardens. Elegant houses stood proudly behind black iron gates, their driveways filled with gleaming cars. Daniel felt smaller with each step, painfully aware of how out of place he looked, his unshaven face, ragged clothes, and the faint smell of the streets clinging to him. Finally, he stopped in front of a massive mansion. The gate alone looked like it cost more than anything he had owned in his entire life. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding. What if they think I stole it? What if they don't believe me? He wondered. For a moment, he almost turned back. But then he thought of the old man's face on the ID, and he forced himself forward. At the gate, a security guard in a crisp uniform immediately eyed him with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" the guard asked sharply, already reaching for his radio. Daniel raised his hands slightly, trying to appear non-threatening. "I found this wallet last night in the park," he explained, carefully pulling it out of his coat. "It belongs to a man named Richard Hale. This address was inside." The guard narrowed his eyes, scanning Daniel from head to toe, clearly doubtful. But when he glanced at the wallet, genuine leather, high quality, he hesitated. He spoke briefly into his radio, then said curtly, "Wait here." Minutes later, Daniel was escorted through the gates and into the mansion's foyer. He couldn't help but gape at the sight: gleaming marble floors, chandeliers sparkling like stars, and paintings worth more than anything he'd ever seen in his life. He felt like he'd stepped into another world, one where he didn't belong. Then, from the grand staircase, an old man appeared. His silver hair was neatly combed, his suit perfectly tailored, and though his face carried years of age, his sharp eyes still burned with authority. Daniel recognized him instantly from the ID photo: Richard Hale. "What's this about?" Richard asked, his voice deep and commanding. Daniel stepped forward nervously and extended the wallet. I found this near a bench in the park. I think it's yours, sir. Richard took it, opened it, and carefully examined its contents. Every bill, every card was still in place. Slowly, he looked back at Daniel, studying him intently. You didn't take anything, he said, almost as if testing him. Daniel shook his head. No, sir, it wasn't mine to take. Richard tilted his head, clearly intrigued. Most people, given the chance, would have stolen something, if not the cash, then at least the cards. But here stood a man who had nothing, yet refused to take what didn't belong to him. After a long silence, Richard spoke again. Come, sit, have breakfast with me. Daniel blinked, stunned. He hadn't expected anything in return, certainly not an invitation to sit at the table of a man whose life was built in another universe entirely. Hunger gnawed at him, and though he felt unworthy, he nodded. For the first time in years, he followed someone into a warm dining room, where a feast of eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee awaited. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Daniel sat stiffly at the long oak dining table. He had never in his life been inside a room so refined. Polished wood gleamed under soft light, silverware sparkled beside fine china, and a roaring fireplace filled the space with warmth. Across from him, Richard Hale sat down with the ease of someone who belonged to this world, but his eyes never left Daniel. Eat, Richard said, gesturing to the plates being set before them by a butler. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in a while. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before hunger overcame pride. He picked up his fork and tasted the food. The flavors burst on his tongue, fluffy eggs, buttery toast, sizzling bacon, and before long, he was eating faster than he meant to. Richard didn't comment, only watched with a faint, knowing smile. When Daniel finally slowed, Richard leaned forward. Tell me something, son. Why didn't you keep the wallet? You could have disappeared with the cash, and no one would have ever found you. Daniel wiped his mouth with the corner of a napkin, his voice steady but quiet. Because it wasn't mine. I know what it feels like to lose everything. I couldn't put someone else through that. Hard times don't give me the right to be dishonest. Those words settled heavily in the room. Richard's expression shifted, no longer skeptical, but contemplative. He had met countless people in his life, businessmen, politicians, social climbers. Most wore masks, hiding their greed beneath charm. Yet here was a man who had nothing, but still carried himself with a dignity that money couldn't buy. Do you know who I am? Richard finally asked. Daniel shook his head. Just what was on the ID? Richard chuckled softly. I'm Richard Hale, billionaire. My companies employ tens of thousands of people. And yet, I cannot recall the last time someone treated me with such honesty. He paused, then added, you returned what many wouldn't have. That tells me more about your character than any resume could. Daniel looked down, embarrassed. I wasn't expecting anything in return. I just thought it was the right thing to do. And that, Richard said firmly, is why you deserve more than you think. In the days that followed, Richard had his staff arrange meetings for Daniel. He discovered Daniel had once been a skilled mechanic before life unraveled after losing his job, his home, and eventually his family. Instead of pitying him, Richard offered opportunity. He gave Daniel a position at one of his companies, starting with stable work in the maintenance division. He arranged housing, a modest apartment at first, and provided clothes to help him start anew. Daniel was overwhelmed. He had gone from shivering on a park bench to having a key to his own front door. Every night he lay in bed, hardly believing this was real. One evening, Richard visited him and said, "Do you see, Daniel? Money doesn't always reveal a man's worth. Integrity does. When you had nothing, you showed me more wealth of spirit than most men I've met. That's why I chose you." Tears stung Daniel's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt like a man again, not a shadow on the streets, but someone with dignity, purpose, and hope. And all of it had begun with a single decision, to return a lost wallet.